There is a thing about a tide that people who live inland never quite understand. It does not care. It does not know your name, and it does not know how tired you are, and it has never once, in the whole history of the world, waited for anybody. It comes in and it goes out, and the difference between arriving in time and arriving 9 minutes late is not a matter of degree. It is a matter of whether the thing happened at all. This is a story about a young woman who thought she had a problem with mornings. She did not have a problem with mornings. She had a problem with the conversation. Sallow Creek was a tide mill village, and if you have never seen one, the whole thing works like this. On the rising tide, you open the gates and let the water fill a pond behind the mill. Then you close them. Then, as the tide falls away outside, you open the sluice and let that trapped water run out through the wheel, and it turns, and you grind. You get about 4 hours, twice a day, and the times move by roughly 50 minutes each day, so there is no such thing as a settled hour. You get the tide gives you, and this week it is before dawn. Ines Vol was 23 and she had the mill at the top of the creek, which had been her father's. She was good at it. I want that established early because it matters. She could read grain by feel. She dressed her own stones, and the flour that came out of that mill was better than the flour that came out of the two below it. She simply could not get there on time. The tide before dawn was the problem. Her room was above the wheelhouse, and it was cold in a way that got into the bones, and the bed was warm, and every single morning she woke to the smell of the mud flats through the shutter. That green, low, salt smell that means the water is going. And every single morning she had a conversation with herself. It is very early. You did not sleep well. You could take the evening tide instead. You could go tomorrow. And here is the thing she did not understand for a long time. She never won that conversation. Not once. Because the person arguing against her was her, and she knew every single one of her own weak points, and she was arguing at 4 a.m. against somebody who was already tired. So the water ran out through the wheel with nobody at the hopper, and the mill turned for 4 hours, grinding nothing at all. And by the time she came down, the flats were shining and empty, and the whole thing was over until the evening. Her brother Peter took the flour into town on the cart, and by that autumn, he was going twice a week instead of 4 times, and the innkeeper had started buying from the mill at the bottom of the creek. Orla Sund had that mill. Orla was about 50, and she had been running the bottom mill for 22 years, and in that time she had missed, by her own count, 11 tides. 11 in 22 years. People in Sallow Creek said it the way you say a fact about the weather. One morning in October, Ines came down at 9 with her hair still wet and found Orla at the bottom of the creek path, sitting on an upturned barrow with a bag of grain across her knees, waiting. Orla looked at her. Then she looked past her at the empty flats. She said, "You missed it again." Ines said, "I'm sorry." And Orla said, and this is the sentence that stayed, "Don't be sorry to me. I ground mine." That night, Ines made preparations. She has said since that she made very good preparations, and that is exactly the point. She set out her boots by the door. She filled the lamp. She put the grain sacks at the foot of the stairs. She wrote on a piece of slate and propped it where she would see it. One word, go. Then she went to bed at 8, and the tide was at 4:20, and she woke at 4:20, and she looked at the slate, and she read the word, and she thought, not this one, and she slept until 7. 2 days later, she woke on time, and she got up. She actually got up, which she had not managed for months. But she was slow. The lamp had gone out, and she had to find the flint. The boots were by the door, but her coat was not. The grain was at the foot of the stairs, but the sluice key was still hanging in the wheelhouse, and by the time she had it in her hand and got the gate up, the pond was already half away. She ground for 40 minutes. She should have had 4 hours. She sat down on the wheelhouse step afterwards with the flour dust on her arms and put her face in her hands. Orla came up the path about an hour later. She did that sometimes, and she never explained why. She stood looking at the half-empty pond. She said, "You were up in time. I was. But your night was arranged for missing it." Inez looked at her, and Orla said the second thing, which took Inez about a year to fully understand. "You keep trying to win the argument. Stop having it." This is where it changed. And it did not change because she found more willpower. She changed the room. She moved her bed out of the warm corner and put it against the seaward wall, so that the first thing that touched her in the morning was cold air off the water instead of the last of the fire. She stopped taking her boots off at night on tide weeks. She gave the sluice key to Peter and told him to be at the wheelhouse door at the tide. Every tide, whether she was there or not. Because now there was somebody standing in the dark waiting for her, and you can argue with yourself, but it is much harder to argue with a person who is already outside in the cold. And she stopped setting the alarm for the tide. She set it for 20 minutes before the tide, because she had worked out that the conversation happened in the gap between waking and moving. And if there was a task waiting the moment her feet hit the floor, there was no gap for it to happen in. She has said since that this was the whole of it. Not discipline, removal. She took away every place the argument could stand. The following Tuesday, she was at the sluice in the dark with the key in her hand 9 minutes before the water turned. And she stood there in the cold, listening to the creek going out, and she felt nothing dramatic whatsoever. She just opened the gate and ground for 4 hours. And once she was there before dawn, week after week, she started noticing things she had missed for 3 years. The fishermen at the creek mouth were not down there when the tide turned. They were down there before it. Mending, sorting, ready. Orla's pond gate was always already closed when Inez walked past on the rising tide, which meant Orla had shut it in the dark hours earlier, while Inez had been asleep. The innkeeper's boy came for the flour at 7. Orla's was on the step at 6. Nobody in that creek who did well was doing anything clever. They were simply already there. Then, in March, the sluice jammed. It was a spring tide, the big ones, twice a month, twice the water, and twice the run. The gate came up 4 inches and stuck, and there was silt behind it, and one of the guide timbers had swollen with the wet. 3 years earlier, that would have ended it. She would have stood there and watched 4 hours of the best grinding water of the month go out through a 4-inch gap. But by then, Inez had a habit that had come from nowhere in particular. She had started keeping the old iron bar and a wooden maul in the wheelhouse, instead of in the shed 40 yards away. For no reason except that one wet morning it had been annoying to walk for them. She had the bar in her hands in about 11 seconds. It took her 40 minutes to free the gate, working in the dark with the water already dropping, and she lost about a quarter of the pond. She ground 3 hours instead of 4. She said afterwards that those 40 minutes were the proudest of her life. And not because she was quick, because the tools had been standing there, put there months earlier by a version of herself who had simply stopped making things difficult. 6 years later, Sallow Creek had 4 working mills instead of 3, and Inez had 2 of them. And one evening, Orla Sund came up the creek path and sat down on the wheelhouse step, which she had never done before, and took something out of her coat pocket and held it out. It was a wooden peg, old, worn smooth, about the length of a finger. Inez turned it over. "What is it?" "Sluice pin. Off my first gate. It broke. It doesn't matter when. I kept it." "Why give it to me?" And Orla said, "Because for about 10 years I thought the pin was what held the water." Inez waited. "It wasn't. It was going down there in the dark before I felt like it. Every time. That's the only thing that ever held anything." the peg is still in that wheelhouse. Inez drove a nail into the beam above the hopper and hung it there, and people ask about it, and mostly she just says it came off an old gate. But when the young ones come, and they do come, because Sallow Creek has a reputation now, and when one of them asks her how she is so disciplined, she never says anything about discipline at all. She says, "Stop arguing with yourself in the dark. Just make it so there's nothing to argue about." So let me ask you something. What time does your argument happen? 'Cause you have one. Everybody does. There is a specific gap in your day, usually between waking and moving, sometimes between finishing work and starting the thing that matters, where you sit down opposite yourself and negotiate. And you lose. Every time. Not because you are weak, but because the person on the other side of that table knows exactly what you are like when you are tired, and picks their moment perfectly, and only has to win once. You are not going to out-argue them. You have been trying for years. Here's the one thing you can do this week. Do not try to win it. Close the room it happens in. Find the gap, then put something in it. Not motivation. A task. Something so small and so immediate that your feet are already moving before the conversation can open. Boots by the bed. The thing already on the table. A person waiting who will notice. And then do it while it still feels difficult. Because it will feel difficult. And feeling difficult is not a sign that it is not working. It is what it feels like. Because you do not lose to laziness. You lose to a conversation you should never have opened. The tide does not argue with you. It just goes. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who may need to hear it, and subscribe to Second Wind Tales for more meaningful stories about hope, courage, and personal growth. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.